Hello and welcome to Post-Charlottesville Speak Up for Civility. How many people do you know who have blocked friends from their Facebook page because of comments they made related to Charlottesville? Avoiding differing opinions by blocking them does absolutely nothing to address the serious divide that's taking place in this country. Many in this country, and especially our youth, were surprised by the existence of white supremacist organizations. That speaks loudly to our collective ability, or should I say, our collective inability, to recognize how profound the role racism plays in this country today. The time has come, indeed it's overdue, to have conversations about race. And we should be having them at home, at work, in our communities, and with a focus on our future, definitely in our schools. I'm Gloria Francesca Mengual, Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator for the Open Choice Program. Prior to working with CREC, I spent 13 years traveling around the country, working with communities that were challenged by a range of incidents, and most of them did have a racial component to them. I've watched people come together to talk, to develop relationships, to identify what it is that is their common values, to heal and to move forward, to strengthen their communities. These facilitated conversations are having similar positive impacts in schools throughout the country. So early during 2017, the Southern Poverty Law Center conducted a teacher survey. More than 10,000 teachers responded. And what the study found was that what was going on in schools was not limited to rude remarks, but indeed to actions. There was a lot of bigotry and bullying and harassment going on in the schools. Our classrooms are just one of many social environments and reflect what's going on in society in general. Throughout the latter part of the last school year, tensions around issues like race, immigration, our religious differences, they've all been on the rise. Confrontations have been happening at demonstrations, there have been injuries, indeed, there have been deaths. And those have been televised, tweeted, Instagrammed, and absorbed in many ways, shapes, and forms by youth all summer long. The end result has been that some students feel emboldened to lash out at, quote unquote, the other. And other students feel afraid. Some are angry, and many feel insecure. During 2017, there have been an increased incidents in schools. So for anyone who's thinking, oh, kids will be kids, how bad can it be? Consider that marked increase in racial, ethnic, and religion tensions. And yes, it's happening nationally. But never mind nationally. Look at some of the stats that are up on the slide right now. These are Connecticut incidents. Take a few moments to just look through what has happened in Connecticut. We need to remove the elephant from the classroom and talk about it. Schools have a responsibility to discuss history in the making. Students are inundated with messages about things like Charlottesville's demonstration. There's information and often misinformation that's coming out, and it's coming out at a rapid pace. Respectful conversations about our varied opinions on many things, including race, are being had in classrooms throughout the country. We cannot afford to whitewash our history. While moving into uncharted dialogues can feel unsettling, and many teachers have expressed that they are not comfortable doing this, we need to move past that discomfort and see the opportunity these times offer to teach students how to have a civil discourse when we do differ. We all know the preamble to the Constitution. We've learned it in high school history class. Presenting an idealized version of American history no longer is an option. Our systems were never designed to treat all people equally. Let's take an example. In nearly every state, our founding fathers determined that only white men who owned property could vote. They were also the only ones who could have a say in how the country operates. The system was never, ever designed to give equality to the poor who didn't own property, to women, to indigenous people who lost their land, or to the Africans who were brought here in chains. And these inequities did not end with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Jim Crow laws followed. And structural racism, it continues to this day. The only way healing can really happen is if we become more familiar with today's reality for people of color and other marginalized groups in this country. That's going to be a sometimes uncomfortable process, no doubt. But we have to be up to that challenge and lean into that discomfort, because we need to stop talking at each other, or worse yet, not talk at all. Instead, we need to make the time to sit with each other, with people of different skin tones, and hear each other's stories. As that study found that was done, that survey, many teachers aren't comfortable discussing in the classroom topics like racism, or ethnic or cultural differences, or religion. You know, we've been taught, many of us have been taught, that that's not a polite thing to do. It's not, quote unquote, appropriate conversation. The truth of the matter is that it's not comfortable. We all need to lean into that and address that elephant in the room, or these tensions are not going to disappear. This is a learning opportunity. That being said, we need to find out ways to reach out to our students effectively. During last year's presidential election, one teacher explained how she wanted to show her students an example of civil discourse. So she showed an Obama-Romney debate from the election before as an example of that. The student response was, "That's boring." So were the 2016 debates that we just had and the presidential tweets we are now experiencing the new normal? Let's hope not. So what happened to civility in the classroom discussion about race, religion, and politics? We're all familiar with the activity of showing how rumors spread, where a teacher will tell a student in the first row in the classroom, will whisper something in his or her ear and then ask that student to turn around and repeat that to the student in back of them. And off it goes through the classroom, one person repeating it to another quietly. By the time it gets to the end of the room, 20 students and 5 minutes later, you have a very different message. Today, via the web, Snapchat, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, it's not 20 students in 5 minutes. It's 2,500 students and 10 seconds later. So let's welcome to the world of good and bad, black and white. Technology has moved us there. It's a world where we all can choose to live in a bubble of whatever world of news and information we want to hear. A growing number of messages delivered via social media and directly at school campuses around the country is coming from the AltRight, and that is a strategy that is being used to attract youth into that movement. New Yorker author Benjamin Wallace Wells, he described the alt-right, and now I'm quoting, as loosely assembled far-right movement, unquote. And he goes on to say that one way to understand the alt-right is not as a movement, but as a collective experiment in identity. In the same way many people use anonymity on the internet to test more extreme versions of themselves. Their websites have been very appealing to teens as well, where they can, quote unquote, try on alt-right versions of themselves. And in the process, what they're doing also is learning to be politically intolerant. Opinions and values vary in this country. You know, some people feel There's too much government regulation. Others feel there's not enough. Some feel that the federal government has too much power and the power should go to the states. Some do not. The safety net, many feel, is way too small and people are falling through it, and it's been disastrous. Others feel we should pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and the safety net is too big. Many from each party are polar opposites on very important issues. So how can we discuss our ideas with so much difference of opinion, so much divisiveness, and so much finger pointing? Youth already are learning in the classrooms that many opinions and values exist, and we have a right to have them. Active listening, that ability to hear out someone else's ideas and opinions, I'm talking about really, really hear out and listen, and not be forming your own response in your head while the other person talks. It's a skill that needs to be taught more strongly today, more than ever. It's a skill that will be used by students not only in the classroom, but throughout their lives. A good way to frame it is by talking about it from the perspective of anyone who wants to take a leadership role on has to develop this good listener skill. So what is a civil discourse? As you see on the slide here, it's a respectful sharing of ideas and opinions where different perspectives are not only tolerated, but encouraged. We need to put a stop to the blame game, and that means being open enough to listen to the perspective of the other. Our students, not only our students, but we as adults, we need a set of guidelines to ensure a civil discourse, a respectful sharing of each other's ideas. And the guidelines, truly, they make all the difference. Today, we have an opportunity to create discussion opportunities and discuss incidents that weigh heavily on the minds of many today, whether that be Charlottesville or DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or what do you do with Confederate statues, which is very much in the news today. We need to do that in a respectful and productive way in the classroom. What the conversation guidelines do is help us to have what could be a hard and probably will be a difficult and an often passionate discussion, but in a civil and respectful way. So here's some sample conversation guidelines that I've used when working with residents and communities throughout the country. The important thing to remember is that it really should not be spoon-fed to them. Have your students work with you to create those guidelines. If you do it that way, they will own the guidelines, and you won't have to be the conversation control cop, is what I call it. Your students will call attention to the guidelines if they're not being followed, but only if they have taken a role in creating them. So, and the other thing to try to avoid is if you have more outspoken students, you might have only 3 or 4 students that are calling out the guidelines for the whole group. You really want to get consensus. So when a recommendation for a guidelines comes up from a student, look around the room and ask for a thumbs up. And if you don't see all thumbs up, continue the conversation about why that ground rule guideline doesn't work for somebody, or what can we do to tweak it so it does for everybody. I guarantee you, if they come up with the guidelines with you, they will own them and help enforce them. You know, and you'll have in your back pocket, and then here's some really very good guidelines to have in your back pocket. Most of the time when I've worked in communities or in schools, 75 to 80% of these guidelines have been brought up by the students themselves. If there's a big one or two that are missing, I'll toss it out there at the end and say, what do you think of this? And we'll have a discussion. And most of the time, they opt to add that to the guidelines that they already created. So I use these questions to start up the conversation with a group of students at an area magnet school. It was the last week of school, so it was June. Students had started sharing stories about themselves. their accomplishments. Some talked about very painful losses. All of that during the conversation in response to one of these three questions. I gave them the option of answer any one of those three. Now, mind you, the students had spent the whole year together in this class. Some of them had been in multiple classes over the years. They were all seniors. Yet everyone in that room was learning something new about their fellow students. One young man approached me after we finished and he said, when you came in and said you're going to help us build relationships and talk about race through storytelling, I thought it was going to be a disaster. I thought a few of us would be having a good laugh when things fell apart. But they didn't. That was powerful, thank you. Many of us have no idea how hungry our students are to hear each other's stories and how powerful they can be. I have facilitated these dialogues among Civility school staff, and it was equally powerful. They are such an effective tool to help reach a common understanding and really understand where the other comes from. So once your students have shared on a personal level, you can get more into the issue. But it's vital to do that relationship building in the beginning, in the first few questions, that really answer who is this other person before you get into opinions and issues. Here are some examples when you do go deeper of what you could ask. Again, the guidelines will help the conversation remain respectful, even when the students disagree. And you see some good example questions of going deeper here. It's also really a good idea to close with questions about what it is they can do to put their understanding and empathy into their schools, into their lives in general, within the confines of the spheres that they live in. It closes with a sense of hope, of action, and closing on a positive note is key. Pay attention to the classroom layout because that will impact the flow of the dialogue. The best format is to sit in a circle without any tables or any furniture in front of you. If they're sitting in their small desks facing each other, that's fine. Open with the students identifying things that make this a safe space so they can share what they're thinking and how they feel. That is the guidelines. And refer to those guidelines whenever necessary. It's important to step back from the teacher mode to the listener. As a facilitator of the conversation, you're mostly in the background. The quieter you are, the better. You're there to step in and keep the flow of the conversation going, and if need be, remind students of the guidelines. But a good conversation will really take off on its own. If there are interruptions that continue and you've done the ground rules and guidelines and it's still happening, you can use a talking stick, which is another format of circles that one person speaks at a time, whoever has the stick speaks. I've been doing these dialogues for 15 years and I have not needed to use the talking stick. It's always been very much a civil discourse. Again, it's the guidelines that make all the difference and a well-trained facilitator to keep the flow going. So what's the teacher's role in the conversation outside of keeping the flow going and stepping back and not being too present, really leaving it to the voices of the students for the most part? Well, you need to read body language and facial expressions of students, especially the quiet ones. The guidelines should have one saying, don't make it personal, and don't let anybody sidetrack that conversation with a supposed quote-unquote fact. I've had people do that in groups where they just were insisting that the fact they were putting out there was definitely the truth. And what I have done is ask for someone in the group to volunteer to look that up online, not now please, but look that up and let us know later in the day or tomorrow what you found out. The important thing is to stay focused on the dialogue. And if you need to remind people, we've only got, 45 minutes left and we have to get through 3 other pieces. So we're not going to go down that road with that fact. So pull it back into the dialogue. That's another role. Try to stay away from misinformation. And then there's the power of the journal. We all process things very differently. Some of us need to have some downtime to reflect. Other students and adults that are more extroverted feed off of the energy around them and the people. But there are students, as you well know, that just need to be with themselves. Taking some time to journal, I'm talking 1 or 2 minutes, really does help them collect their thoughts so that they can then share some of the aha moments. Just giving them that time to settle in and really think through what they are absorbing will be much better when it's a feedback time for sharing reflections. By all means, build in a debrief session. That's a very important component when the conversation concludes. This brings closure to what was discussed and it highlights what was learned. The student feedback also will give you a better ideas of ways to make future dialogues even better. Moving forward, it's really important to use instances of incivility as teachable moments and to stress that there is no need to blame and shame. If an incident happens in your class, use that opportunity to describe an observation of what it was that just happened. It's almost like taking a picture of it. What did everybody see or experience? Describe how that comment or action that you witnessed made you feel, or how it appears to have made a student feel in the room. And note to students the need for all of us to feel heard and respected. If time doesn't allow you to have that conversation about what just occurred right then and there, and the incident highlights a conflict that continues to resurface, let your student group know that there will be a dialogue about this in the near future. And by all means, follow up on that promise. So here are 10 ways to a better conversation. This is covered very well by interviewer Celeste Headley in a TED Talks, where she shares these rules and expands upon them. So if you just want to jot down Celeste Headley, Headlee, TED Talks, you'll find her 10 Ways to a Better Conversation, or just Google 10 Ways to a Better Conversation TED Talks and you'll find it. It's well worth the few minutes of length. So you can see here, don't pontificate. If you don't know, say so. And don't equate your experiences with theirs. It's not about you. Oh, I lost my pet 2-3 years ago. It's not your turn to talk about that. And I can't say enough about listening, the importance of active listening. Truly listen. It's the most important skill you can use during a conversation. And I've decided to give prominence to guideline 10 with its own slide. Be brief. A good conversation is like a mini skirt, short enough to retain interest, but long enough to cover the subject. So this is quote unquote from her video. So it's a lot of fun to watch and a good learning opportunity. The main point obviously being made here is people lose interest when someone rambles on after they've already made their point. So getting clogged up with too many details does nothing to the conversation. So check her out. So are incidents like Charlottesville the jumpstart that civics education needed? And when I say civics education, that's not something that only needs to be taught in a civics or history class, as you well know. It could be part of English. It could be woven into math. It can social studies, you name it. There are many opportunities in a school setting to weave these discussions into the classroom content. Conversation is key. And yes, civic engagement is declining. And you can see from some of the points here that educational policies are strengthening that decline. And you see the impact of that just by walking down the street and asking a few adults basic questions about their government. can be pretty scary. That being said, my glass is perpetually half full. Today we have such an opportunity to open up discourse about our views, about our values, and within that conversation are opportunities where we can identify what is it that we have in common and ways that we can move forward together and respectfully. So, next steps before facilitating student dialogues about racism. How ready do you feel? If you feel comfortable, go for it. I know that there are school administrators and teachers and social workers and guidance counselors and psychologists, etc., that they've been having rich conversations with students throughout their careers. So if you feel ready, congratulations, and as Nike says, just do it. If you'd like to prepare further, participate in a new facilitator training for educators that's being offered by Open Choice to the districts the students from Hartford go to. And please do check online for multiple excellent resources. Speaking of resources, here are some links to very useful resources to talk about things like racism, the Charlottesville experience, racism. So I'm not expecting you to quickly jot those down, so I will give you my contact information should you want some of those links or any other information related to this presentation. You can reach me at gmengual@crec.org, and my number here is 860-509-3768. So thank you so much for taking part in this webinar, and do feel free to reach out to me should you want to expand on what this covered.